Good day, this is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you with my latest rant of the week. This week, I decided to make the supreme sacrifice for the cause of independent journalism. I forced myself to watch the 51-minute Trump-Netanyahu press conference twice. That amounts to 102 minutes of unrelenting depravity. How I managed to survive that experience is anyone's guess. Fortunately, I'm here today to tell the story of what I witnessed and endured during those 102 minutes. Before I show you clips from this tawdry affair and offer you my observations on those clips, there's an obvious question to answer. Why would I subject myself to this torture? My answer is that Trump has an uncanny tendency to blurt out inconvenient truths that sometimes give us invaluable glimpses into his true agenda. In that regard, this press conference certainly did not disappoint. Our story begins last week when Trump imposed 17% tariffs on the genocidal entity of Israel. I discussed these tariffs in an interview with economic researcher Shir Hever, which Reason to Resist published earlier this week. Now, after Netanyahu received dire warnings from Israeli manufacturers about the impacts of these tariffs, Netanyahu decided to jet off to Washington on short notice to see the Donald. Netanyahu's goal was to persuade Trump to give the genocidal entity a free pass on the Israeli trade relationship with the United States. The U.S. is, in fact, the genocidal entity's largest trading partner, and the U.S. consistently buys more from Israel than Israel buys from the United States. The U.S. goods trade deficit with Israel was $7.4 billion in 2024, an 8.6% increase over 2023. Now, on his way to Washington from Israel, Netanyahu made a pit stop in Hungary, where he was warmly embraced by Hungary's genocide-loving Prime Minister, Viktor Orban. Last year, after the ICC indicted Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, Orban thundered that the indictment was brazen, cynical, and completely unacceptable. To Orban's chagrin, the International Criminal Court responded to Netanyahu's trip to Hungary by sending a request that Orban's government arrest the mass murderer several hours after he arrived in Hungary. Rather than comply with its obligations under the Rome Statute of the ICC, the genocide-loving Orban announced that Hungary would withdraw from the International Criminal Court statute. From Hungary to Washington, Netanyahu's plane, which the Israeli regime refers to as Wings of Zion, took an unusual flight path to Washington. The plane flew from Budapest through Croatia, Italy, and France, all of which are members of the International Criminal Court, but none of which was willing to comply with its obligations under the ICC statute. This alternate route added about 400 kilometers to the journey from Budapest to Washington. The plane took this route because the Israeli regime believes that Ireland, Iceland, and the Netherlands, which lie along the shorter, more conventional flight path, would all enforce the ICC indictment. Now, it might surprise you to hear that the Netherlands would do that. After all, its government in recent years has been implacably pro-Israel. I suspect that there's a simple explanation for this, and it is that the ICC is headquartered in The Hague, which is in the Netherlands. The ICC's presence in the Netherlands, moreover, brings both prestige and revenue to this tiny country in the north of Europe. By refusing to arrest a criminal against whom the ICC has issued an indictment, the Netherlands government would be discrediting this institution, which brings significant benefits to the country. In any event, Netanyahu's plane arrived in Washington this past Sunday, April 6th. On the following day, April 7th, Netanyahu met with Trump. They then held their 51-minute press conference. Before I show you clips from this affair, I'd like to offer a few general observations about the press conference. First, both Netanyahu and Trump were dressed in the colors of the United States flag: a blue suit, a white shirt, and a red tie. This brings me to a subject I've long thought worthy of comment, and that is that Netanyahu's peculiar talent, in my opinion, and what has made him more successful at retaining power than any other prime minister in the history of the genocidal entity is that he masquerades so effectively as a US politician. This man, if you ran into him on the streets of New York City and he was speaking English to you and you didn't know who he was, you would naturally assume that he's a New Yorker. He doesn't speak with an Israeli accent. He uses idioms that are common to Americans, ordinary Americans, and he dresses like an American politician. And for that reason, the American public tend to find him to be credible and tend to relate to him far better than they would relate to somebody who speaks to them in a thick Middle Eastern accent and doesn't look, sound, quack like an American duck. So this, at the end of the day, may be the single most important reason why Netanyahu has managed to remain in power so long in a country that depends for its very existence on lavish support of the United States government. My second general observation about the press conference is that Trump did almost all the talking. At the outset of the press conference, both Trump and Netanyahu made a brief statement. Netanyahu's opening statement was devoted almost entirely to stroking the Donald's ego. When Netanyahu completed his sycophantic praise of Trump, Trump invited questions from the press. After that, during the Q&A, which took up more than 80% of the press conference, Netanyahu spoke only one time and did so only after Trump invited Netanyahu to answer a question about what they plan to do with Gaza. In total, Netanyahu spoke for only about 5.5 minutes in this 51-minute press conference. This is consistent, by the way, with my view, which I've expressed often, that in the U.S.-Israel relationship, it is the U.S. government that is the boss. The Israeli tail does not wag the American dog. Dogs just don't work that way. They wag their own tails, and Israel is the tail on the American dog. The third and final general observation I have about this press conference is that the White House press corps is an affront to journalism. Every single question they put to Trump and Netanyahu was basically a softball question. Not once did any reporter in the room challenge either Netanyahu or Trump on the cascade of lies that they spewed relentlessly during those 51 minutes. Now, let's take a closer look at the most revealing clips from this press conference.
Steve Witkoff, President Trump's very able representative, helped us get a deal that got 25 out. We're working now on another deal that we hope will succeed. And we're committed to getting all the hostages out, but also eliminating the evil tyranny of Hamas in Gaza and enabling the people of Gaza to freely make a choice to go wherever they want. I mean, they should have that choice. And the president put forward a vision, a bold vision, which we discussed as well, including the countries that might be amenable and are amenable to accepting Palestinians of their free choice if they choose to go there. And I think that's...
So why doesn't Netanyahu mention any of these countries that are amenable, as he puts it, to accepting Palestinians ethnically cleansed from their homeland? In fact, during the course of this press conference, Trump and Netanyahu asserted on no less than 3 occasions that there were many countries out there that were ready to accept displaced Palestinians. And on each and every occasion, they refused to identify a single one. Perhaps the reason why these mystery countries don't want to be identified is because they don't exist. Perhaps another reason is that if their populations find out that they're talking to the Americans and Israelis about accepting ethnically cleansed Palestinians, there will be an explosion of anger in their countries. But I think the most important and quite frankly appalling part of this clip is the whole notion that if in fact there are countries out there willing to accept displaced Palestinians, then those who leave would be doing so of their own free will. Now, let's think about that for just a second. You come to a Palestinian who has been through 18 months of genocidal Israeli rampage in the Gaza Strip, and you say to them, hey, look, we've blown up your schools, we've destroyed your hospitals, we've shot many of your children in the head or in the heart, we've decimated your mosques, there's no sewage system, Virtually the whole of Gaza is flattened. There are contaminants everywhere. And if you don't leave, we will continue to slaughter you mercilessly and starve your population. But it's entirely up to you whether or not you leave. This is a question of your free will. And you have the option of remaining here in this hellscape that we have created, but you're enabled to go. It's all up to you. Now, what sane, rational person with a basic sense of human decency would think that choosing to leave that hellscape would constitute an act of free will? But what's even more shocking about this is that not one of the prostitutes who was in that room with these two war criminals managed to ask that simple question. Not a single so-called journalist. Now let's take a look at the next clip.
We also discussed the situation in Syria. We've had neighborly relations with Turkey that have deteriorated, and we don't want to see Syria being used by anyone, including Turkey, as a base for attack in Israel. Turkey is a country that has a great relationship with the United States. The president has a relationship with the leader of Turkey. We discussed how we can avoid this conflict in a variety of ways, and I think we can't have a better interlocutor than the president of the United States for this purpose. And of course, we also discussed Iran. Look, we're both united in the goal that Iran does not ever get nuclear weapons. If it can be done diplomatically in a full way, the way it was done in Libya, I think that would be a good thing. But whatever happens, we have to make sure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons.
Yes, of course, we can't possibly have a better interlocutor than Donald Trump, because after all, he is the greatest human being ever to have been produced by the human species. But let's focus more intently here on what Netanyahu had to say during this clip. First of all, he suggested that Syria had been used as a base for attacks on the genocidal entity. Where is the evidence to support this contention? It is in fact Israel, which occupied the Golan Heights since 1967 and illegally annexed it, as virtually every Western government has acknowledged for decades. It is in fact Israel that has carpet-bombed Syria relentlessly, including the destruction of the Iranian embassy in Damascus last year, which constituted a flagrant violation of international law and an act of war against both Iran and Syria. It is Israel that is moving its troops into Syria day by day since the fall of Bashar al-Assad. And in fact, it was Israel that contributed to the downfall of Bashar al-Assad, who was, despite all of his many serious flaws, the internationally recognized leader of Syria. So we're to believe in these circumstances that Syria is the threat to Israel and Israel is not the threat to Syria. But even more mind-blowing in this little spiel that we just heard from Netanyahu is the idea that Iran simply cannot have nukes. Now, why do I say that? Is it because I think that Iran should develop a nuclear arsenal? No, I don't want Iran or any country on God's green earth to possess a single nuclear weapon, especially a country like the United States, which has demonstrated a willingness to use those weapons on civilian populations, as they did in the case of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But more to the point about Israel, Israel is the only state in all of West Asia that possesses nuclear weapons. Israel is the only state in all of West Asia that is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the United States, by the way, happens to be flagrantly violating its obligations under that treaty to work towards nuclear disarmament. In fact, Trump did exactly the opposite during his first term when he withdrew the United States from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, a pillar of the nuclear disarmament treaty regime. Finally, the Islamic Republic of Iran entered into a deal with the Obama administration, which was well designed to prevent Iran, which has declared that it does not want a nuclear weapon, from obtaining such a weapon of mass destruction. And it was the opinion of the International Atomic Energy Agency that Iran was complying with the deal when the Trump administration withdrew from it and thereby opened up the door to further enrichment of uranium by the Islamic Republic. So the reason why we currently find ourselves in this situation where, Iran could develop on relatively short notice a nuclear weapon is precisely because the Trump administration in Israel destroyed a deal that was well designed to prevent that from happening. And despite all of this, the U.S. intelligence agencies in their annual threat assessment, which just came out a few weeks ago, opined that Iran is not seeking to develop a nuclear weapon and that the supreme leader of Iran ended any program designed to achieve that result over 20 years ago, back in 2003. The final aspect of this clip that I want to comment upon is the notion that, we should follow, in the instance of Iran, the model that was developed in the case of Libya, which many years ago, before the fall of Muammar Gaddafi, the overthrow, I should say, by Western powers of Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan Republic agreed to give up any effort to obtain a nuclear weapon. Interestingly, experts in the field interviewed officials of the Libyan government a few years after they came to that decision, and this was before the government of Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown by the West. And what they related to these experts was that while the Libyan decision to dismantle the nuclear weapons program was initially lauded as a new model for negotiated counterproliferation, it was clear even before 2011, when a popular uprising backed by Western powers toppled the Gaddafi regime, that other states would be reluctant to follow Libya's example. As I discovered, says this expert, in interviews with Libyan officials less than 2 years after the deal was announced, many had come to regret their decision. The officials I interviewed in Libya during 2005 and 2006 felt cheated and humiliated. Many expressed frustration with the limited economic benefits from the deal, which did not spark the broader economic revitalization many officials had hoped for. They chafed at being treated as second-class participants in international fora, despite having voluntarily abandoned the program to reintegrate back into the international community. Now, let's just put that aside for a moment. Subsequent to all of this, of course, Libya was absolutely obliterated by NATO bombardment in a criminal war of aggression on the Libyan people. And ever since then, their country has laid in smoking ruins, even though their government, the one that was overthrown by the West, agreed to put to an end any initiative to obtain nuclear weapons. So let's go back to the clip here where Netanyahu actually has the audacity to cite the example of Libya. If you're sitting in the position of other countries, in particular the Islamic Republic, and you hear him cite the example of Libya as a model to follow, why would you want to go down that path when you know that despite Libya's agreement to give up any initiative to obtain a nuclear weapon, the West destroyed it anyways? Doesn't sound like a recipe for persuading the Islamic Republic to do another deal with the Trump administration. Let's have a look at the next clip, shall we?
We've put a major hurt on the Houthis, which nobody's been able to do. We've really hit them hard, and they know it, and they don't know what to do. And it's every night, night after night, and we've gotten many of their leaders and their experts. They're experts on missiles. I mean, they actually make missiles. Nobody thought that, but they make missiles. They're highly sophisticated, and they're very tough, but they've been very badly damaged. Nobody else was able to do that but us. Pete, you want to discuss that, please?
Yes, sir.
That's right, folks. They've been very badly damaged. That's why they continue to fire missiles at the mighty United States Navy in the Red Sea and at the genocidal entity itself. Now, what I found most interesting about this clip is the idea that the admission, startled admission, I might add, by the Donald that the Houthis, as he puts it, are capable of making highly sophisticated missiles. Those are the words that he employed. As if, how could it be that an impoverished Arab nation that we have decimated over more than a decade of brutal illegal warfare could possibly make highly sophisticated missiles. Well, guess what, Mr. Donald Trump? The peoples of the Arab world are eminently capable of doing that and much more. But this takes me to a tweet that Donald Trump put out recently in which he was lauding the fact that the U.S. military in a drone strike had just wiped out dozens of what appear to be Yemeni civilians. And in that tweet, Trump had the following to say: "These Houthis gathered for instructions on an attack. Oops, there will be no attack by these Houthis. They will never sink our ships again." Again? Well, when you combine that interesting nugget with the admission that the Houthis, as he put it, have developed highly sophisticated missiles and are tough, well, that sounds to me together like an admission that the Houthis have actually sunk United States naval vessels. We'll never know for sure because, after all, the United States doesn't like to make any kind of admission about its military incompetence or the military prowess of its enemies. Let's have a look at the next clip.
We have a great military. There's no military
like our military. And despite Biden having given a lot, but nevertheless a pretty small piece, but it was a lot of our military weight in Afghanistan. One of the dumbest situations, I think, and maybe the most embarrassing situation we've ever been involved in. That short period of time in Afghanistan, what a disgrace that was. But left a lot of our military behind. Left. You see them in their annual parades when they're parading trucks that are armor plated and different things that they get. But it's many billions of dollars we left behind. But despite that, we have a tremendous military. That was a very small portion because we rebuilt the military during my first term, and we have great things happening with our military. We also essentially approved a budget, which is in the facility. You'll like to hear this, of $1 trillion, $1 trillion. And nobody's seen anything like it. We have to build our military, and we are getting a very, very powerful military. We have things under order now, the likes of which we've never had before. We've never had the kind of aircraft, the kind of missiles, anything.
That's right, folks. The Trump administration is putting together the biggest military budget in the history of humanity, and certainly in the history of the United States, a $1 trillion military budget. I found it quite comical, frankly, that he glanced over at Netanyahu and said, "You're going to like to hear this," when he announced that they were going to have a $1 trillion military budget under the second Trump administration. Now, I'm having some difficulty reconciling this boast with statements made by U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth recently in regard to military spending by the United States. It was only weeks ago that Hegseth told the American media that he wanted the Pentagon to cut 8% from the defense budget for each of the next 5 years. That would be an aggregate of a 40% reduction. And at the same time, Donald Trump is boasting to us all that the U.S. government is going to raise the military budget to an unprecedented level of $1 trillion per year. That doesn't sound to me like cuts in military spending, folks. At the end of the day, this is all just kabuki theater. All of this talk of restraining military spending, whatever Elon Musk might do about waste in the military industrial complex of the United States, it sure as hell ain't going to result in a significant reduction in the gobs of money that the United States government continues to throw at merchants of death. Our next clip contains some interesting commentary from Donald Trump about the EU's need for energy. Let's have a listen.
We have a deficit with the European Union of $350 billion, and it's going to disappear fast. And one of the reasons and one of the ways that can disappear easily and quickly is they're going to have to buy our energy from us because they need it. They're going to have to buy it from us. They can buy it. We can knock off $350 billion in 1 week. They have to buy and commit to buy a like amount of energy. And we have that. We have more energy than any country in the world. I don't know if you know that. He knows everything. But the one thing he may not know, we have more energy than any country in the world. We have more of every kind of energy, every form of energy, from oil and gas to coal. And people talk about, I call it beautiful, clean coal. As you know, Germany is opening up a coal plant a week. They tried the windmills and it didn't work. They tried all the other solutions and they were ready to go out of business. Now they're doing a coal plant a week. China is now up to 2 coal plants. They're opening 2 major coal plants every single week in China, all over China.
Well, where does one begin to even talk about this clip? First of all, Trump looked over at Netanyahu and told him that he knows everything. That's right. The war criminal is omniscient. There's nothing that man don't know. Second interesting comment of this clip is the claim by Donald Trump that Germany is opening up 1 new coal plant a week. Well, I haven't been able to find confirmation of that fact, and it may be a grotesque exaggeration, but there certainly is an important kernel of truth to this because the media, the so-called mainstream media, have reported that Germany has decided to bring back mothballed coal plants to help keep the lights on. And according to this particular report we're looking at, the energy crisis in 2022, the one that resulted when Germany committed economic suicide by depriving itself of relatively cheap and reliable Russian gas, forced the country to lean more heavily on burning coal to produce electricity after Russia curbed its pipeline gas supplies to the country. Again, that's not true. It didn't curb its pipeline gas supplies. The Europeans, with the help of the United States, and I'll come back to that, greatly reduced their reliance on Russian gas. So according to this article, the phase out of Germany's last remaining nuclear reactors in the spring is set to limit power supply even further this winter, leaving it in a potential tight spot without additional support. This is a report from November of last year. So a few notable aspects of this clip. First of all, the German government that implemented this policy of reviving mothballed coal plants was supposed to be an environmentally friendly government in which the Green Party of Germany played a central role. Now, you don't have to be a climate scientist to know that burning coal is significantly worse in terms of controlling the emission of greenhouse gases than the burning of gas. Secondly, the contaminants that result from the burning of coal are worse than the contaminants that result from the burning of gas. So there's little that could be more environmentally irresponsible than increasing your reliance, as the Green Party of Germany advocated, on the burning of coal. The second point I want to make about this clip is that Donald Trump here is echoing a sentiment that was expressed quite shamelessly by the former U.S. Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, after the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And just to remind you, here's what Blinken had to say.
Ultimately, this is also a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy, and thus to take away from Vladimir Putin the weaponization of energy as a means of advancing his imperial designs. That's very significant, and that offers tremendous strategic opportunity for the years to come. But meanwhile, we're determined to do everything we possibly can to make sure that the consequences of all of this are not borne by citizens in our countries, or for that matter, around the world.
So you heard Blinken say that the destruction of Nord Stream constitutes a tremendous strategic opportunity for years to come. Well, in that clip, he didn't say for whom it offered tremendous strategic opportunities. Guess what, folks? Donald Trump has provided to us the answer. It was the United States, which is going to benefit and has been benefiting from the destruction of Nord Stream because it has increased Europe's reliance upon liquefied natural gas from the United States, which is much more expensive and also is more polluting than pipeline gas. That's the result of the wonderful policies of the German Green Party. Our next clip also concerns U.S. relations with the European Union.
The EU has been very tough over the years.
I would say it was formed to really do damage to the United States in trade. That's the reason it was formed. It was formed with all of the countries from Europe, I guess most of them, not all of them, but most of them, and they formed together to create a little bit of a monopoly situation, to create a unified force against the United States for trade. So they have NATO, which is largely the same countries, and they took advantage of us dollar-wise and militarily until I got there. I was able to get $600 billion from NATO, where they paid NATO, because most of these nations weren't even paying. We were paying for NATO, so we're paying them to guard them militarily, and they're screwing us on trade. So that's kind of a good combination. So now it's really turned around. It's the opposite, and the European Union's been very bad to us. They don't take our cars, like Japan in that sense. They don't take our agricultural product. They don't take anything practically. And yet they send millions of cars in a year, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, BMWs. They're sending millions and millions of cars into the U.S., but we don't have a car that's been sold to the European Union.
We don't have a car that's been sold to the European Union. Well, in 2022, U.S. automobile manufacturers sold in excess of 116,000 new U.S.-made cars in the European Union. That doesn't sound like no cars to me. But it is true that the Europeans, US or European auto manufacturers, sell many more cars in the United States than American car manufacturers sell in Europe. In the same year, 2022, European auto manufacturers sold almost 700,000 cars in the United States, as opposed to the 116,000 vehicles sold by US auto manufacturers in Europe in that year. Now, why might that be the case? Well, I'll give you two reasons, and I say this as somebody who spends a good deal of time in Europe, is a citizen of Greece, has a car in Greece, drives a lot around this country, and that is that US vehicles tend to be much larger than European vehicles. And driving vehicles of those hefty sizes that you typically see amongst US auto manufacturers is quite inconvenient and difficult on the streets of European cities. And the second thing is the price of gas in Europe is significantly higher than it is in the United States. And so consumers here are putting a premium on fuel-efficient vehicles, which the American automobile manufacturers aren't particularly fond of. In fact, they love these huge, powerful gas guzzlers, particularly their ram-tough pickup trucks. And those types of things are just not particularly appealing to many European purchasers of automobiles. So this goes to a fundamental point about the US trade deficit. To a large degree, it is due to the fact that US manufacturers and the producers of other US-made goods are not competitive vis-a-vis foreign entities in the same industries. So there's nothing unfair about this. It's not a rip-off. It's just the incompetence and the lack of productivity and competitiveness of US corporations. Now our next clip is a doozy.
But they were so happy when we made that first deal because we did get a lot out. You know, I had people right in this office, this beautiful Oval Office. They came in, 10 people, hostages, you know that. And I said to them, so how was it? And the stories they told me, I mean, as an example, I said to them, was there any sign of love? You were there, 10 people. It's only 10, but it's pretty representative. Did the Hamas show any signs of, like, help or liking you? Did they wink at you? Did they give you a piece of bread extra? Did they give you a meal on the side, like, you know, you think of doing? Like what happened in Germany, what happened elsewhere. People would try and help people that were in unbelievable distress.
Like what happened in Germany? It appears that the Donald is referring to World War II and the country that led the perpetration of a Holocaust and murdered not only 6 million Jews and many millions of others, but 27 million Soviets engaged in some extraordinary acts of kindness that appear nowhere in the historical record. But more pertinently for present purposes, this idea that the hostages, none of them thanked their captors or expressed the view that they had been treated kindly is flatly false. In fact, there have been Israeli captives who emerged from Gaza in the most recent prisoner exchanges who thanked their captors, even going so far as to say, I owe you a huge thanks because thanks to you, I'm alive today. Now, to the extent that there are such persons, and certainly there are captives who have been extremely critical of Hamas and have made claims that they were abused, mistreated in captivity, I think it's fair to say that any of the captives who have a different view and actually felt that they were treated in a humane way in extraordinarily difficult circumstances by their Palestinian captors, they're not going to get access to Donald Trump. There is no way in hell that the Israeli regime will allow those people to meet personally with Donald Trump and express their views about how they were treated by Palestinians in Gaza. And of course, and this is typical of the entire press conference, not a single word was uttered, either by Netanyahu or Trump, or by any of the so-called journalists who were present in the room, about the fact that Israel has thousands of Palestinian hostages in detention as that press conference was being held, and many of them were being tortured as that press conference was being held. Many of them have emerged in the course of this prisoner exchange from the Israeli dungeons, showing signs of starvation, mistreatment, medical abuse. None of that got any mention at all, even though they are far more numerous, and they have been, many of them, in Israel's dungeons for a far longer period of time than any of the hostages who were taken captive in Gaza. Our next clip relates to the question of Chinese military spending. Have a listen.
Of billions of dollars a year on trade to China. We lose hundreds of billions of dollars overall, probably close to $2 trillion. Why would we do that? Number one, why would we do that? And then you have to say, is it sustainable? Then you hear about all of the people that say, well, deficits. If we have a deficit with the country, or if the country has a big surplus with us, like China has a massive surplus, that they take and they spend on their military. Well, we don't want that. I don't want them to take $500, $600 billion a year and spend it on their military. I don't want them spending money.
Now, Trump's reference to $500 or $600 billion a year might lead you to believe that that is the approximate amount of money that the People's Republic of China spends every year on its military. However, you'd be wrong about that. This year, after a 7.2% increase in military spending, China's military budget will amount to about $245 billion. That is less than a quarter of the $1 trillion military budget that Donald Trump is now boasting about. Not only that, but China is surrounded with U.S. military bases, whereas there are no Chinese military bases on or anywhere close to the coastline or the borders of the United States. There's no Chinese military base in Canada or in Mexico or in the Caribbean or in Central America, and the Chinese spend less than a quarter of what the U.S. government will spend under the first year of the second Trump administration. And we're supposed to believe that China is a threat to the United States? You can't be serious, Donald Trump. Now, I want to show you a clip that I thought was particularly revealing vis-a-vis the motivation that Donald Trump has for waging a tariff war on the entire world. Here's what Trump had to say.
Problem is they cheat. They cheat like crazy. Canada cheats, Mexico cheats, just one of those things. But we are resetting a table, and we're going to have great trade, and we're going to have a very strong country. Our country is going to be at a level that has maybe never been, or maybe, our country was the strongest, believe it or not, from 1870 to 1913. You know why? It was all tariff-based. We had no income tax. Then in 1913, some genius came up with the idea of let's charge the people of our country, not foreign countries that are ripping off our country.
Yep, Canada cheats, Mexico cheats. How they cheat, we don't know, because the Donald doesn't tell us. The Donald simply acts on the assumption that if the United States is in a trade deficit with another country, it can only be because that country is quote-unquote cheating. It can't possibly be the fault of the United States. But that's not the most important aspect of this clip. The most important aspect of this clip is Donald Trump referring to a point in time in the early 1900s when the United States had no income tax, but derived a huge amount of revenue from tariffs. And that, my friends, is almost certainly the primary motivation for this tariff war. I'm not saying it's the exclusive motivation, but Donald Trump is a billionaire, or so he claims to be. He is surrounded by and funded by mega billionaires. And he has made clear throughout campaigning for political office and throughout his first administration and now in the second part, or the first part of his second administration, that he hates income taxes. But he knows at the same time that you can't operate a $1 trillion a year military without having enormous amounts of revenue, not to mention the other essential functions that the United States government should play. So how is he going to achieve his objectives of destroying the income tax regime, which at least has done something to limit the growth of inequality in the United States? How is he going to achieve that objective without finding a massive new source of revenue? That massive new source of revenue is tariffs. And in pursuing this tariff war, so that he can fund massive tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy and for himself, he is risking economic chaos. I have a few more clips I'd like to share with you before I close out this rant of the week. This one relates to United States military aid to Israel.
Maybe not. Maybe not. Don't forget, we help Israel a lot. You know, we give Israel $4 billion a year. That's a lot. Congratulations, by the way. That's pretty good. But we give Israel billions of dollars a year. Billions. It's one of the highest of, and we give a lot of countries money. You wouldn't believe if I said we give Afghanistan a lot of money, didn't it? Because that was a Biden deal, another Biden deal. Not only did he embarrass us with that, but they give them billions of dollars, Afghanistan, right? So.
That's right, Donald. $4 billion a year after year, especially when there are millions of people in the United States living in the streets and tens of millions don't have health care. That is a lot of money. But what I found most notable about this admission that it's a lot of money is that Donald Trump cut himself off. He started to say that the amount of money given to Israel is one of the highest, and then he quickly caught himself and segued into some kind of an inane conversation about the money that was given to Afghanistan by the U.S. government, a country which was effectively destroyed by 20 years of illegal U.S. warfare. We're supposed to believe that the United States government before the Trump administration was unduly generous to the Afghans. But why did he cut himself off? What was he going to say when he said one of the highest? Well, I'm going to hazard a guess here. What he was going to say is that Israel has been the largest cumulative recipient of U.S. foreign aid since its founding back in the 1940s, receiving about $300 billion adjusted for inflation in total economic and military assistance. That is indeed a lot of money. The second last clip I'd like to show you relates to what Donald Trump describes as oceanfront property in Gaza.
Do you think that's the way to pressure Hamas to get to a deal? Do you think blocking humanitarian aid is also an effective pressure? Well, you know how I feel about the Gaza Strip. I think it's an incredible piece of important real estate, and I think it's something that we would be involved in. But having a peace force like the United States there, controlling and owning the Gaza Strip would be a good thing. Because right now, all it is for years and years, all I hear about is killing and Hamas and problems. And if you take the people, the Palestinians, and move them around to different countries, and you have plenty of countries that will do that, and you really have a freedom zone. You go to the freedom zone, a free zone, a zone where people aren't going to be killed every day. That's a hell of a place. It's a, what I call it, a great location that nobody wants to live in because they lose out. And when they have good living, real living, where Hamas and all of the problems, the level of death on the Gaza Strip is just incredible. And I've said it. I don't understand why Israel ever gave it up. Israel owned it. It wasn't this man, so I can say it. He wouldn't have given it up. I know it very well. There's no way. They took oceanfront property and they gave it to people for peace. How did that work out? Not good.
Yeah, there is indeed a hell of a lot of killing in Gaza, Mr. Trump. And the man who is primarily responsible for that is sitting to your right. And that's why they've indicted him at the ICC for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Of course, in all this talk about Gaza being unlivable, no one, including the prostitutes in that room, want to mention the elephant in the room. And it is that Israel made it that way and did so intentionally for the purpose of ethnically cleansing the Gaza Strip. Yet again, also, we saw here that Trump claims that there are many states out there that are willing to take displaced Palestinians, but he's unable or unwilling to name a single one of them. Why? And finally, the reason that Israel left Gaza during the rule of Ariel Sharon was not because the government of Ariel Sharon, who was one of the worst perpetrators of the criminal settlement enterprise in the West Bank, was interested in achieving a just and lasting peace with the Palestinian people. The reason why Sharon withdrew Israeli forces from Gaza and then continued to occupy it on its borders was because the burden of protecting those settlers inside Gaza, whose Palestinian population at the time was 1.5 million people, was, in the view of Sharon, excessive, and he wanted to reallocate the military resources towards border security. It had nothing to do with wanting a lasting and just peace with the Palestinian people. Now, the final clip I want to show you has to do with Donald Trump's threats against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
And second question about this. A lot of people think that those talks are not going to lead anywhere because the Iranians will never give up. If diplomacy fails, is the United States under your leadership ready to take military action to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and remove this threat?
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran's going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon. You know, it's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is. You can't have it. Right now we have countries that have nuclear power that shouldn't have it, but I'm sure we'll be able to negotiate out of the two as part of this later on down the line. But Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And if the talks are successful, I actually think it'll be a very bad day for Iran if that's the case. Yeah.
Well, for whom will a U.S. attack on Iran be a very bad day? The U.S. military failed to defeat the Taliban over 20 years of brutal warfare backed up by the entirety of NATO's military forces. The U.S. military has failed to defeat Ansar Allah in Yemen over 10 years of savage warfare on the country. The U.S. and all of its NATO allies have had their asses handed to them by the Russians in Ukraine. And we're supposed to believe that the U.S. can defeat Iran and can do so at a time when U.S. weapon stocks are so depleted? And what about Israel's nukes? What about Israel's refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty? What about the fact that JFK, before he was assassinated, was trying very hard not to allow Israel to obtain a nuclear weapon? What about Trump pulling out of the JCPOA, the Obama-era nuclear deal with Iran that was effective to prevent the Iranians from developing a nuke, and that the Iranians were complying with, according to the IAEA? What about the threat assessment for 2025 of U.S. intelligence agencies that, in fact, Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon and has not been seeking one since 2003? All these questions were compelling questions to ask, but the so-called journalists who were in the room asked none of them. Yet again, the corporate media are sleepwalking us into a major war. And so I must repeat a maxim that I have expressed many times. When it comes to war, never, ever, ever believe the Western corporate media. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you with my latest rant of the week.